So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's new in housing dogs and cats in shelters. And some of this, I want to share the research that we've done through the Correct Shelter Medicine program. 3 studies: a dog elimination study, a cage size study, and then a cat behavior study, which is really piggybacked on this cage size study where we took video of cats in their housing units. I'll share some housing myths, things that we're seeing design-wise, or things that we've seen instituted with good intention, but have some consequences that were not necessarily intended, and talk about some of that. And then also some just housing concepts that we really like to see provided to animals in shelters. Actually, before we talk about what's new, I want to talk a little bit about some of the dog behavior that has been looked at. And this is in conjunction with the elimination study that we did. In going through the literature, this work was done in 1948 by Sherman Ross, a researcher. This was during the time when they were really just documenting some of the animal behaviors. And this fella had dogs that were housed in a laboratory setting, and they were just observing where defecation occurred within the kennels. These dogs were housed in larger kennels, but just single compartment kennels. And they documented that, as other researchers had done previously, that the dogs had a restricted area where they defecated. And they also looked at, so these were adult dogs, but they also looked at litters of puppies too. And they noticed that at about 28 to 30 days, these litter of puppies would also demonstrate this restricted area for defecation at 30 days of age, 28 to 38 days of age. The other really interesting thing about this study was that they had 2 dogs that were housed and that they were observing that never defecated in their kennel because they had an opportunity to defecate outside. These 2 large dogs had to squeeze through a tiny little window, but they preferred to do that to defecate outside. And for the days that they were observed, they never defecated inside their kennel area. So at this time, he described the factors of importance seemed to be age and development of the subjects as to where the defecation was restricted to, access to other areas for defecation, and then cage conditions. So in some more recent work that Sandra and I were involved in, we put together a study. We wanted to look at where dogs were eliminating in a shelter environment when dogs were given a double compartment cage, being a double-sided cage, with our hypothesis being that dogs would show a preference for elimination away from where the food, bed, and water was. And this quote that's over here on the left, Hediger was a Swedish researcher, looking at animal behavior, primarily wildlife, but noticed that in some animals there's a great significance to the dispersal of feces and urine beyond that for just waste disposal. These are the kennels that were in this research. These are double-sided indoor kennels, pretty typical. Guillotine door and another side that's empty on that other side. So the bed, food, and water is all on one side. There were 579 dogs in this study. Average age was around 3 years of age. They were observed daily for up to 12 days. On average, they were observed for 7 days, with over 4,400 daily observations. And the unique thing about this study is that these dogs were walked, the majority of the dogs in the study were walked 2 to 3 times daily. So for about 42% of the dogs, there was no elimination in the kennel. The staff observed every morning whether there was elimination in the kennel and the location of it. And so for 42% of the dogs, the daily walking program took care of their elimination needs. But for 58%, there was some elimination, whether it was urination or defecation within the kennel. And for those dogs that eliminated in the kennel, as I said, the location was marked on a sheet in front of the kennel by the staff, saying where the elimination occurred, whether it was on the side with the bed, food, and water, or if it was on the other side. We didn't mark specifically where it was just whether it was on one side or the other. And you can see for these dogs, eliminating, this is defecation and this is urination, there's a very distinct preference showed by these dogs in these 4,000, over 4,400 days of observation of where they chose to eliminate. So in summary on this particular study, walking programs are great. If we can institute them and get these dogs out to meet their elimination needs, excellent. But it doesn't provide for all the dogs' needs. And so having housing that can provide them an opportunity to eliminate away from where their food, bed, and water is, food, water, and bed is important so that they can express this behavior. And I'll take a little time right now just to talk about double compartment housing. I think this is the housing we often associate with kenneling dogs. This has been pretty traditional. Unfortunately, we're seeing some backing away from double compartment housing into single compartment housing because, one, it takes up less space for the facility. So in a new building of a facility, cost is paramount. And so some of the considerations are maybe we can, house a dog in a single kennel and it'll cost less. But there are some disadvantages to single kennels, and one is that there's some disadvantages for staff. In double compartment kennels, the dogs can be put on one side or the other while the staff takes care of one side or the other. So we have a safety issue, and we can provide really efficient care. The whole room, the dogs can be on one side of the kennel or the other, and the staff can take care of a whole row of kennels. There's another issue which comes along with this in that if we don't have to handle the dogs during this high-risk time of cleaning, we reduce the risk of disease transmission. And this is simply a handling issue, as is safety is a handling issue. If we don't have to handle them, we can take care of them. And double compartment housing allows this, where single compartment housing becomes much more involved. This is just a picture from a shelter in Vancouver, British Columbia. These are, 6 to 8 week old pups. There's 6 of them here, mostly a blur. But you can see they have an older shelter. It's a double compartment shelter. And this front part of the kennel is clean, no elimination at all. This is morning, right before cleaning time. Their food and water dishes are here, their bed's here. And you can see all the elimination from all 6 of these puppies is in the other compartment. No one went in there and trained these little devils to eliminate over there. This is an innate behavior of them at this age. So if we can provide them housing like this, these guys are going to stay cleaner. And they have the ability to express that behavior. Most of you are familiar with crate training, yes? So when we send dogs home or puppies home and we're explaining them how to do crate training, we're tapping into this behavior. This is the second study, and this is in cats. And we're looking at cage size, the effect of cage size on cat well-being in shelters. This study was done in a shelter, local shelter, municipal shelter. We only included adult healthy cats. They could be strays or surrenders that had to be handleable. Because Keith here, one of our undergraduate students who helped me on this project, had to be able to handle these guys. There were about 200 cats in this study, and they were assigned to either a large cage or a small cage, which I'll show you in a second, by their identification number that they got at intake. So assignment was via that method. Here's the 2x2 cage. This is pretty traditional shelter cat housing. We call these 2x2 cages. They're actually about 21 inches interior diameter and this way. But within this housing unit, there's a feral box for hiding, litter box, and food and water. And here's the larger cage. This is a 4-foot cage. It's 30 inches high though, so a little bit higher. Same amenities as the small cage, but again, double in size, and it's a double compartment. And the main compartment is over here with the hiding box and the food and water. And then the litter box side, basically over here. There's a portal going here, and there's also a portal in this particular cage up there. There's also a shelf above the feral box. And so we did some observations. One was a behavioral stress score. We used an observational stress score where cats are scored from, it's a 7-point system, 1 to 7. 1 being extremely relaxed, and 7 basically being terrorized. None of the cats in this study scored 1 or 7, but they scored in between that range. Their appetite was recorded daily, simply as eating, not eating, or eating some. Weight was taken at intake and then recorded weekly thereafter. Cats were observed daily for upper respiratory infection, and then outcome was also looked at. And this study, preliminary results on this study, there was no significant difference between the two groups, so cats that were housed in the small cage and the larger cage for weight, appetite score, or upper respiratory incidence. And the vast majority of cats in this particular study got upper respiratory infection. But there was a difference in some of the parameters, and one of them was their daily stress score. And you can see cats in the large cage are across this row, and in the small cage across this row. And for the first, day 0 is their intake day. Day 1 is their first 24 hours, and there's no difference between the two groups in their stress score, these first two instances. But by day 2, we saw a significant difference occur in the stress scores, with the larger cats in the larger cages having a lower stress score. And that was significantly different, and that maintained through day 7 of that stay. And then also in outcomes, there were differences between the two groups as well. When we looked at adoptions, the percentage of cats adopted from the large cage was greater, significantly greater than the number of cats adopted from that had stayed in the small cages. We looked at euthanasia. More cats were euthanized that had been housed in the small cages than had been housed in large cages. Again, both significantly different. And this graph just depicts that in graphical form, with the stress score over here, day in shelter, and this is number of cats euthanized. The blue line is the stress score for the cats in the large cages, and the red line is the stress score for the cats in the small cages. And you can see right here at about day 2, those diverging. And if you think about what's happening in shelters when decisions are being made about cats, based on what we can observe, it's really important for cats to show themselves in their best behavior, best way, in order to get up into adoption. This is a third study, and I'm cruising right along. The third study I wanted to talk to you about, and this was piggybacked on the cage size study, so it's using the same housing units that we did, but now we're going to videotape what the cats are doing in this first 24 hours. Actually, it was we used about 15 hours of the first 24-hour period of time, but I'll show you that. Christy Camillo was a resident of ours who finished up her program last year, and she presented this at last year's House Officer presentation. So I'm basically presenting her work, although we worked quite a bit together on this. So same shelter, same housing, same assignment to large and small cages. all the cats that were in this study were enrolled in that previous study. But in addition, we set up video cameras to record their behavior. They were continuously recorded, and nighttime recording, these had infrared sensors, so we could also record their behavior at night. And this is just a picture from one of the video. It wasn't completely, it was a little grainy. The pictures were a little grainy, but enough so that they could get a pretty good idea of what that animal was doing. So these videos were reviewed and then scored. The behaviors that the cats expressed were scored. And there were 16 different behaviors. There's only so many things that really a cat can do in that small space. But the behaviors were recorded in increments of 30 seconds. And they were looked at how long they expressed that behavior, how often the behavior occurred, and then time of onset of that behavior. And for that, we looked at time of onset with survival analysis. The behaviors were broken down into neutral, positive, and negative, and the time that those cats spent in those behaviors. And you can see the blue is the neutral behaviors, and in both the large cages and the small cages, the cats spent a very similar amount of time doing neutral behaviors. But the difference that came out of this duration, looking at the duration of time, was that in positive versus negative. In the large cages, cats spent quite a bit more time in positive behaviors, less time in negative behaviors, where that was flipped around for the cats that were in the small cages, spent a lot more time doing negative behaviors than positive behaviors. And a couple of these behaviors, this is a lateral recumbent position. You can see that the cats in the small cages could get into this position a little with some difficulty. Really the only position in that cage, the only place in that cage that would allow them to get in that position is on top of their feral box, but they could. In the large cage, they could get in that position on the shelf or on the floor. And in the large cage, they spent about 5% of their time, and 2/3 of the cats expressed that behavior, where in the small cage, less than 1/10 of the time was spent in that behavior, and only 14% of cats expressed that. Another behavior, so the lateral, very relaxed position. Then we looked at sternal lateral. This is another relaxed, not as relaxed as lateral, but we're seeing a little bit more time spent in that behavior in the large cage, 18% of the time, excuse me, with 70% of the cats expressing that behavior. Again, this is in the first 16 hours of being in the shelter. While the cats in the small cages, 1/3% of the time is spent in that behavior, with only a little over 1/4 of the cats expressing that. And here's a sternal recumbent sort of position. This is we classified as a neutral behavior. And very similar across cage type, with all the cats expressing this behavior. This is a really interesting graph to me. I didn't know that it would pan out this way. This is a survival analysis, Kaplan-Meier survival analysis curves. And the red line is cats expressing this behavior in, this is time to lateral in the small cage. The blue line is time to lateral in the large cages. So every time a cat expresses that behavior, this graph pops down. And you'll see this would be the whole population, 100%. And as the behavior occurs, and at the time that it occurs, this graph will continue to step down. And you can see after this 15 hours of time, about 75% of the population has expressed this behavior. And you look at the cats in the small cage, and just very few of them have even express the behavior, but the duration to expressing it is also extended out. And that's very significant between the two groups. Time to elimination, so we looked at how long it took them to just use their litter box, and again, statistically significant between the two groups. The cats in the large cages, nearly all of them eliminated prior to the end of this 15-hour time. Actually, they all did, with only less than half of the cats using their litter box in the small cages. Some of the grooming and eating and drinking were also more absent in the small cages, but because we had such small numbers, it was not significant statistically. So if we would have had more numbers, it would give us more power and may have seen some significant difference in those areas as well. So self-maintenance, elimination was delayed or absent in the small cages. This is an indicator of welfare and has implications for animal health. Cats in the large cages exhibited positive behaviors quicker, with more frequency, and with longer duration. And these positive behaviors correlate with lower stress scores, which we saw. And stress is directly linked to risk of illness and euthanasia. We know this in many other studies that have been done. In this particular study, we did not see a link with stress and upper respiratory infection because, and there's probably some explanation for that, which I won't go into right now, but that shelter was unique in the way that these cats were occasionally exposed to dogs and dogs' noise because the surgical facility was in the cat housing area, so once a week dogs were brought into that facility, and may explain some of the things that we expected to see that we didn't see, which was upper respiratory infection in these cats. But as I showed before too, behavior in the first few days is critical to the outcome of these cats, and we saw that in this study. So this study, as well as the previous study, which are together, really give us a much better understanding of confinement housing, how it affects cats, and it helps us as we consult with other facilities and architects and shelters, especially when they're going to build new facilities and provide housing. Gives us background information for making housing recommendations. It also helps us as we think about what we can do in existing facilities to improve housing. And it doesn't just apply to animal shelters. We have a lot of implication for us as veterinarians in practice and for helping places that are boarding facilities, really anywhere where cats are confined. I'll talk briefly about this, but this was in the Oprah Winfrey magazine. I think it was last year. And it was just a 2-page article about how we, the type of environment we put people in hospitals and the effect of the hospital environment on recovery. And this was there were probably 8 or 9 different studies that they had reviewed and just discussed them. And sum them up, these numbers on these related to different studies that looked at flooring type, rooms that had a view, etc., and found that, and summed up this information kind of on this one page. And I just want to go through it because even though this was human and hospital related, it has a lot of implications for how we house and care for animals. Like humans that are confined to a space, our animals are confined to a space as well. And so they talked about private rooms. People were 3 times less likely to catch the flu and got over an hour more of sleep if they had a private room. People that were in rooms that were carpeted had 30% fewer injuries from falls, and visitors stayed about 8 minutes longer. A view of nature. View of trees versus brick led to fewer pain meds and an average of 3/4 of a day less time in the hospital. Rooms that had sound-absorbing ceiling tiles, people got better sleep and had a lower rate of rehospitalization. Light-filled windows, natural lighting. Patients who were recovered in sunny rooms took, again, less pain medications per hour than patients in dim rooms. And in cardiac ICUs, there was a 61% higher death rate when there was no natural light. So the environment that these people were housed in for their recovery had a huge effect on their well-being. And this holds true in our animal facilities as well. I think we have seen sort of a transition through the way we have facilities, where there was a lot of outside space, a lot of windows that were inefficient in older facilities, windows that we could open, and things like that. And then the facility design and facilities went to less windows, more enclosed environment, much more isolated sort of environments. And now we're kind of coming back again to make sure that we get some of these needs met for natural lighting, make sure the ventilation, if we can get outdoor exposure, and incorporating that sort of into a complete system, coming full circle, really. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about some housing myths that we are seeing. And some of these are changing, and some of these are continue to be propagated. So I just want to share some things that we've seen that are well-intentioned. These were done with good intentions. Then it was to protect the animals, and instead they have some consequences that are actually detrimental. This is a adoption housing. This is a California shelter. It's cats are displayed behind these glass windows, and adopters walk along the outside here and can look in through the window and find out about the cat right here. And the thought is putting cats behind something that adopters can't touch them will protect the cats, because we don't want disease to be spread in these cats. But what these windows do is they keep adopters from interacting with the cats. And interaction with the cat at adoption is really critical. Set up an initial bond just to meet the animal. And when we put the glass on there, that's not going to occur. A couple other things are that actually the public, the people that are coming to adopt the animals, are very low risk. They haven't, for the most part, this population, these people, the adopters, haven't spent their whole morning cleaning and caring for animals. Staff is another issue, but these people are very low risk for transmitting disease from them to the animals, and also from the animals that are in adoption, whether it be dogs or cats or any other animals, are the healthiest animals we have in the shelter. So very low risk to transmit disease from one animal to the other. But we've got tons of facilities that are built like this. We also have tons of facilities continuing to be built like this. Unfortunately, when people see it done in a new facility, they think that's the way to do it if they're going to build down the road. So we're seeing more of this type of housing occur that doesn't allow interaction. And this is primarily adoption. I'm talking about adoption. But there are a few ways to get around that. And it's hard to see in this picture, but these, on the back side of this, on the back of house, they're just it's cage, open wire kind of cage housing. And so if we can let the public actually go into the back of house in these shelters, put a billboard up saying, go ahead and meet the cats inside. Then if people see the cat here, they can go back around in and then actually meet them and have some interaction occur. Right now, with the way these are set up, the staff have to be found, and then the staff have to open the door, and it takes a lot of staff time in order to allow interaction to occur. So allowing adopters access when it's possible is one way to get around that. And then in designing new facilities is to ensure that interaction can occur at some point. Design them to allow that to happen. Many adopters, if you ask them how they pick their cat, well, they didn't pick their cat. The cat reached out and picked them. So we want that interaction to occur. This is the same, but on the dog side. We see this less. More dogs in kennels tend to be in kennels that have open barred fronts. So interaction can begin that way, but we're seeing more facilities using glass. I'll talk about a door that allows both glass and it has both glass and wire, allows interaction to occur. But we'll see some issues with this in dogs too. The key here is in dog adoption areas, if this is the type of housing one has, is to make sure you have tons of staff in there. And this might be volunteers to, as soon as someone has found a dog they want to interact with, is to get the volunteer to help them open up the door or whatever they need to do so that interaction can occur. That's how you solve this if this is going on. But in facilities that have very low staff, this can be a problem. It inhibits adoption. This is just a picture of a cat without a hiding place. And what I want to talk a little bit about, and I just heard this within the last 3 months. We were at a shelter, and they didn't provide a hiding spot for the cats because they said they felt it would inhibit getting cats adopted. And there's been research done looking at this. Cry, which was Kay Cry, published an article in Animal Welfare in 2007 with results of the study suggest that welfare of kenneled cats is greatly improved if they are provided with the opportunity to perform effective hiding behavior, so given a hiding spot, and the ability to perform such a behavior does not decrease the likelihood of those cats being adopted. So that's, and there's been other studies looking at that as well. We know that not providing a place to hide can cause cats further stress. Undoubtedly, there are going to be a few cats that are going to hide consistently. And what that is really telling us is that the environment, the shelter environment for those individual cats is not a great place for them. And so getting them into a different type of housing, whether it means getting them out of the shelter into some sort of foster program or different housing type, maybe a single room might meet their needs, changing their housing environment so that they're not always hiding, or making sure that the housing meets the needs of that individual animal. And if the great majority of the population is hiding a lot, that might be a clue that the environment, whether it be housing and the environment or the environment itself, is just very stressful. So making sure that the environment that we're housing those cats in is as stress-free as possible to ensure that they don't hide incessantly may be a first step. But then again, also providing them the ability to hide. And this drawing I just did yesterday. But this is so I'm always trying to think of ways that we can provide housing within the environment. One of the criticisms for providing a hiding place is that staff sometimes can't see the animal. So there's resistance within the workers, and workers want to be able to see the animals. They need to return them to owners if they're lost. They want to be able to observe them if they're unhealthy. So being able to observe the animal is important. But we also want to meet the needs of the cat in providing the hiding. This particular, I call it a curtail because it curtails stress, but it's a little curtain that could be, and I haven't made one of these yet. Any of you guys have a sewing machine here? But these would be it's just basically a curtain that would have some elastic and a button here where they could be put on really easy onto the lower third or so of the cage. Especially in some of our housing units where putting a feral box or a solid structure takes up a lot of the space. Like the 2x2 cage, if you put a feral box in there, you've taken up a whole bunch of that cage size. There's some other things we can do, raised beds and things like that can help conserve space, but figuring out ways that we can provide some hiding feeling for that cat, ability to hide. And this is just a newer one. There's other cage, you can also put up, I've had partial cage covers that go up and down, so half of the cage door is covered this way. And then also that raised bed with hanging a towel over that can provide hiding too. This myth is common and is almost instituted into every shelter that is built that now, and that is visual barrier for dogs. And there is a study that was done by Wells in 1998 that looked at vocalization and activity of dogs when they were given visual access to conspecifics across or not. And it was a small study, but there was no significant difference between noise, vocalization in dogs when they could see other dogs across the way or not. The other thing that came out of that study was that when dogs could see dogs across the hall, in kennels across the hall, dogs moved up to the front of the cage or the kennel. When they couldn't see dogs across the way, so kind of visually boring, nothing going on, they moved to the back of the kennel. Only 25% of dogs, when they couldn't see anyone across, only 25% are at front, meaning 75% stayed to the back of the kennel when they had no other dogs. When there were dogs across the way, 80% of dogs spent their time at the front of the kennel. So putting up really limiting visual barriers around the dog kennel system as a noise abatement is ineffective. But it's effective at a few things, and that is that putting up a big barrier like this is hard to work in that area and to be efficient. It's also it's not visually appealing for adopters. It's just a big barricade. And for the dogs, it's hugely isolating visually. We do want to make sure that we give dogs the ability to get out of the line of sight, so to speak. So partial barriers, similar to what we can provide for cats, to provide them a place for hiding or retreat, can do that as well. So whether it's a solid panel partially across, not all the way, because we want the dog to be able to make a choice here, where they want to see out or not. And here it's done in a glass kind of real life room. So giving them choice is, I think, a better solution. We need to know more about this. Noise abatement in dog housing areas is a big deal. We want to try to limit that as much as possible, but making sure that we meet dogs' needs, I think, is going to be part of the solution. Yes?
In the last slide, if you remove that barrier and you extend up the size of the cages, if they got too close together, would that cause an increase in sound, or is there any study about that?
We don't know. There's so few studies really looking at this. We need more effort, more research in this, really identifying those things that either increase noise or increase the barking activity. We know from work that Dr. Karsten and I finished doing daily monitoring that dogs that come into a shelter and are barking tend to continue barking during their stay. This was on, we marked whether they were barking on a daily monitor. They were monitored once a day at the morning. But those guys continued each time they were observed, they were barking. That stayed consistent. But what happened is other dogs joined in with them over time. By day 3, day 4, it appeared that the noise within the population increased. And what's causing these other dogs to kind of join in, we don't know. My thought is that part of it is that needs really aren't being met. And isolating dogs more isn't going to cause them to quiet down simply because we're actually taking away their choices. They're social animals. They want to see conspecifics. They want to see people. And so we're just in another facility in Colorado where dogs were behind, these were dogs in adoption. They were in double-sided kennels, really pretty, there were 2 rows of kennels, one running right next to each other. And the dogs were pretty close, and I was like, wow, that's going to be really noisy in there. They were glass enclosed all the way around, again, adoption area, so people could be outside of that kennel room, walking around, looking at the dogs through the glass. And then once you went inside, I was like, it's going to be noisy, but it was quiet. Most of these dogs appeared to be happy, being able to look out, see what was going on. The housing wasn't ideal, but it was one of the quietest kennel areas I had been in, and there were 30 kennels inside that room. So I think the word is, we don't know enough about this, but visually isolating animals in an attempt to quiet them down doesn't work. I know that.
I actually just sent Dr. Wagner a picture that social habitat at Dane County Humane Society is actually a really great example of this. They went through the back of their kennels and covered them with white plexiglass to try to reduce barking, and now when you go in, you can see all the dogs standing on their hind legs with their front legs on the top of the barriers and howling so that they can see over them.
But if we, in almost every discussion we have about dog housing, when we're talking with other people about building shelters, the first thing that comes out is visual barriers, visual barriers. And I think there are places for visual barriers when outdoor areas where maybe we'll have a lot of activity going on, and you'll have dogs see other dogs outside, some barking, so providing some landscaping and other things that can kind of disrupt, so not to overstimulate some dogs, but for the most part, giving them choice, working with trying to design facilities so that you don't have to parade a dog down this whole line of kennels. That causes quite a bit of barking, but designing it so that there are easy way outs either in between kennels so you don't have to go through, or it can take dogs out a back way. There's different ways to get around not having to parade dogs up and down in front of each other. Yeah?
I know a lot of boarding facilities will play music or the radio. Has any study actually looked to see if that makes a difference for parking?
Well, there's a study that showed that certain kinds of music, classical music, was mildly helpful.
Yeah,
but
that was.
It was a pretty small effect that they saw. One of the things, and I don't want to take too much time, but one of the things that's been shown to be really effective is a program called Open Paw, where they actually are training the dogs to sit and be quiet when people walk through. So the dogs are getting positive reinforcement for being quiet, and not only does it help with noise levels, but it is pretty appealing to an adopter. It's a very weird experience when you walk into a shelter and you walk into the dog ward and all the dogs flap their butts down and look at you expectantly. Certainly doesn't hurt with adoptions. We wrote that up as an article for Animal Sheltering Magazine, if any of you guys want to see it. The Austin Humane Society was the example that we used, but there's lots of shelters using this program. And there's clicker training programs to do the same thing that Edmonton, Canada uses that program as well.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because what I'm sharing with you today is the things that we're incorporating in design ideas, sort of the physical structure, but there are a lot of things that we can do. If we can get the physical structure good, we can build upon meeting those animals' needs through other management programs, other things that we're doing within the shelter. Really critical to get the housing as good as we can get it, make sure it's meeting the animals' needs, because some of these management things that we can put on top, if we have poor housing, it's really hard to overcome that with management, although management can be helpful. We should still try to do the best we can given the situation we have, but if we have good housing that meets the animals' needs, then these management things that we can do will just build upon that and just make a much better environment. So that's an excellent point. What we're also seeing in the last 10 years or so in design is that we're making a lot of small, and this is typically for cats, smaller and smaller rooms, a lot of them, small rooms. There are good reasons for small rooms. We want some places to be able to isolate cats that are sick and things like that, and oftentimes that doesn't need to be a big room, because if we design it right, we won't have very many of these sick animals, but so we can have some smaller spaces. But having a bunch of rooms, basically for no specific need for separation, just becomes more inefficient, and for the most part, these housing units will be similar perhaps to what's displayed here, and about 6 feet away is a bare wall. And I think a lot of designers, architects, are afraid to put cats across from each other, with the concern being that the cats will get upset if they see each other. But I can tell you what, if there's a cat here and there's a cat here, these two cats know that there's another cat in here, or there's 6 other cats in here. By saying that we're not going to allow them to see each other, it doesn't make for this cat to think that they're the only one in this room. What we want to do, if we open up the room, say we take this wall out and have housing perhaps on this wall and this wall, kind of open up that space. It's more airy, spacious, a nicer place to work in. What we want to do is make sure that we provide cats the choice whether they want to be seen or not. And we can use these partial cage covers and hiding places to allow that cat to make some choice whether it wants to be seen or not. Much more visually stimulating than a bare wall. The cats can watch people when they're working in there. The cats can see other cats. Great if they have a windows to look out of, bringing natural lighting in, etc. So just opening up some rooms that don't need to be super divided. We don't want huge rooms of cats either. There's good reason to have it a manageable number, but we don't need tiny little rooms either. This is a California shelter with that's just, the housing area is just outside or inside from a hallway with glass windows on it. It's a nice, really nice space. Nice place to work in, nice visual stimulation for the cats. And hopefully this summer we're going to get in here and portalize these cages so we have double compartment housing for these cats. Excited about this. I think one of the last things I want to talk about is, actually the second to last, is group housing. We get into some facilities, and especially as we get into kind of adoption areas where group housing is the only type of housing that they have. So all the cats go into group housing, and there's some great things about group housing. Cats can move around. It's just a much more pleasant environment for the vast majority of them. But there are situations wherein group housing isn't either ideal for the cat, where the cat doesn't get along in this type of environment, or actually the management of this environment, the shelter isn't able to really manage this well. So we have a lot of negative interactions between cats. It's not a pleasant place for cats to stay. Some of them aren't eating, don't have access to the litter box, etc. So not all cats really do well in that environment for a variety of reasons. What we prefer in adoption areas is to have actually a variety of housing. Some cage housing for cats that are going to move through really fast. We don't have to, it can be very efficient, easy for staff to take care of, and those cats are going to move through. They can be in cage type housing. And some adopters respond to that type of housing better too. Like they would prefer to adopt a cat that's isolated in a tiny little cage, and they're going to save that cat, versus a cat that might be in a group room that's all decorated fancy and cute, and they're thinking, wow, my house doesn't even look as good as that, so that cat's doing pretty good. I'll save this other cat. So having a variety of housing is important for the adopters too. So not only to meet the animal's need, but adopters' desires too. Having some individual housing that's not cage, I think, is important too, because we have some individuals that might not do well in a group environment, but still need the ability to move around a little bit more. Maybe they're kind of chunky, bigger, not going to get adopted as quickly. Maybe they're that large black cat that's going to be there. a few more weeks than we would like. So having individual housing is good too. So the big news there is a variety of housing. And this last one, this has kind of come up more recently, and this is individual housing of unsocialized or our feral cats. You can see this cat has come up to the front of the cage. I was just walking by it. It's a feral cat, and he was very upset and aggressive coming to the front of his cage. And individual housing for these animals causes them to experience tremendous stress, and this is likely because we're triggering their fight or flight mechanism. And what we would like to do is provide housing where we don't trigger that, or I'm not sure that we can do that in some of these individuals. The mechanism is triggered when we're 20 feet from the cat, but I think we can do a better job in housing these animals if the shelter facility is in a situation where they need to house these guys, by looking at a few things. One is making sure that they don't stay there any longer than they have to, but looking at some group housing options. And this is a shelter in Indiana who has indoor group housing for their unsocialized or feral cats. And you can see they're kind of away, but they've gotten up off the floor, up into these glass kind of window areas, a nice area for them and they feel comfortable. And they could be grouped housed. This is efficient for the staff and easy to care for. The staff don't, when they go to feed and water, they'll take care of all that stuff that's on the floor. And they don't really need to interact with the cats. We've got, in some of the shelters we're designing now, we're talking about outdoor group housing for these cats. So these cats are coming from an outdoor environment, providing them hiding structures and places where they can get out of the weather, roof pens that are basically have a roof on them and protected from the weather, and housing them in that area. So outdoor, what that animal's used to living in, and also more efficient for the staff to care for them on a daily basis with as little interaction with them as possible until their outcomes arrive. And now I have a few minutes left. I really want to spend a little bit of time talking about what we love and love to see in housing. This is cat adoption housing. This is one of the least expensive housing units that Shoreline puts out. It's a laminate kind of housing structure, but what's cool is they're portaled up to down. We know that adopters want cats at eye level, and we know that cats want double compartment, be able to separate the litter from food, water, and bed. And these work really nice because we can have the litter box down here and the food, water, bed up here, and the cats tend to stay up here, and this is where adopters will see them. Great. The other cool thing is these are portaled side to side, so during the slow times of the year when cats going to stay a little bit longer, you can open that up. The cat can have 4 compartments. It just gives some flexibility to that area. This is the door I mentioned. This happens to be on an individual cat housing unit. The thing I really want to talk about is this door. There's a glass component here for us humans to look through, the adopters to look through, which is really nice visually, but also down low there's the open wire. That's vinyl coated wire. But then, so adopters can get down here and interact with the cat on the floor, right here. There's also wire up here, allows more ventilation in this type of housing unit. Really nice. And although this is a cat on a cat, this is what we're going to see in some of the dog housing areas too. So trying to meet aesthetics and interaction. This is a dog door. It's a bifolding dog door. It's kind of that saloon style. It opens this way. And these are pretty cool in that they keep the conditioned environment of the indoor of the kennel inside. And this is an indoor-outdoor kennel. And the outside air can stay outside. But the dogs can have access to the outside and the inside. And 2 very different environments. So meeting the dog's needs for access to an indoor-outdoor kennel 24/7. If the dog door isn't on here, we see a lot of kennels drop the guillotine door during either cold time or too hot times so that the indoor environment stays conditioned. But with dog doors, we can still allow dogs access and provide an indoor environment and an outdoor environment. So very beneficial to the dog, but also to the pocketbook of the shelter for cost savings for environment, keeping the environment. Hopefully there is no question about this, but double compartment housing is the way to go for housing when we're doing cage housing or kennel housing. This is also a small room, kind of real life room type housing, and this is a guillotine door with access to an outdoor area. Double compartment housing, providing double compartment housing in this type of housing is important too. I think we see a lot of real life rooms that are not double compartment, and so we've got dogs basically eliminating in an area termed kind of real life, a living room area. That is a turn off for adopters. When they see elimination in those type of housing units, and we know that the majority of dogs would choose to eliminate away given the choice, and so providing a double compartment in those instances is going to be important too. We see some resistance from architects, however, because it takes up more space. Access to outdoor areas, really nice if we can, as facilities, emulate kind of what we'd like to see animals get in their home environments. So having access to a porch that's enclosed is a really nice, if we can do that. This is actually, this is Berlin, a shelter in Berlin, where the dogs had this indoor area and then a really nice outdoor area. These were circular. It's a circular kennel with about eight kennels in it. There were other issues with that, but that part of it was nice. And then portals, which can help us remodel existing cat housing from a small and inhumane housing structure to a housing structure that meets the cat's needs for their short-term kind of length of stay. And I'll talk a little bit more of that. I might have to do that tonight because we're running out of time, but we're working on getting some portals manufactured thanks to the much help that I'm getting here. Again, this is Dr. Camilla and Dr. Karsten, residents of ours that put these together at San Jose Shelter. This is the new portal, hopefully, that will get out there. This is double compartment housing for puppies. And that is it. Does anyone have any questions? Sort of ran through that a little bit quickly, but we'll be around again tonight. We'll be doing some portalizing locally, at least getting holes cut and working on that. Thank you.